In a peer-reviewed analysis of Amish gut microbiomes, researchers found bacterial diversity profiles that mainstream Americans have not carried in their bodies since before the Second World War. The samples came from children in Holmes County, Ohio. Their intestinal flora looked, in the words of one Johns Hopkins affiliated investigator, less like modern American children and more like rural populations. The industrialized world stopped resembling sometime around 1945. That finding sat quietly in academic journals. It did not make the morning news. But it points to something the Amish have known for 300 years. Something that explains why these communities post measurably lower rates of asthma, allergies, autoimmune disease, and certain digestive cancers than the country surrounding them. The answer is sitting in stoneware crocks in Lancaster County root cellars right now. 10 of them. 10 fermented foods that the Plain community never stopped making, while the rest of America forgot. This is the case file on those 10 ferments, and on the documented anomaly that connects them to a hospital admission rate the rest of the country cannot match. The Amish settled in Lancaster County in 1737. Almost 3 centuries later, their descendants spread across Holmes County, Ohio, Elkhart and LaGrange in Indiana, Geauga County back in Ohio, and dozens of smaller settlements. Roughly 380,000 Plain people in North America. A closed dietary system, a closed agricultural system, and a documented health profile that pharmaceutical research cannot account for through genetics alone. Decades of Johns Hopkins research on Amish populations has documented what investigators now call the farm effect, the protective influence of raw dairy, soil microbes, and traditional fermentation on the developing immune system. The Amish are not genetically separate from their European-descended neighbors. What they are is dietarily intact. They eat what their great-grandparents ate. They preserve what their great-grandparents preserved. And the bacteria that lived in those preserved foods still live in their bodies. Mainstream nutrition science cannot patent a bacterial culture that grows on its own in a cabbage crock. So, mainstream nutrition science has been slow to investigate it. The evidence has been sitting in plain sight, in handwritten community cookbooks, in the back rooms of Plain country stores, in the quiet labor of Amish women who never stopped doing what their grandmothers did. The investigation begins with the first ferment, and the most consequential one. Sauerkraut. The Pennsylvania Dutch made it in 50-pound stoneware crocks, packed by hand in late October when the cabbages came out of the field. Salt, cabbage, thyme, nothing else. A properly fermented Lancaster County kraut develops between 1 and 10 billion live lactobacilli per gram by the 3rd week. That is a probiotic count no commercial supplement on a pharmacy shelf can guarantee, because heat pasteurization kills it. Grocery store sauerkraut is dead. Amish sauerkraut is alive. The difference is documented, measurable, and the reason a single tablespoon at supper does more for the GUT than a $30 bottle of capsules. The second ferment is chow chow, a mixed vegetable preserve, green tomatoes, beans, cauliflower, peppers, onions, fermented in salt brine before vinegar was ever added. The vinegar version is what gets sold at roadside stands. The original, the version Amish grandmothers in Lapp and Stoltzfus households still prepare, is lacto-fermented first. That distinction matters. Lacto-fermentation produces the live cultures. The vinegar finish, when used, is added at the end for flavor, not preservation. A jar of true Amish chow chow carries a microbial profile closer to the gut flora of pre-industrial Europe than to anything in a modern American refrigerator. The third ferment is red beet eggs. Hard-cooked eggs are submerged in the brine of fermented beets. The Pennsylvania Dutch have been making them since the 18th century. The beets are fermented first, beet kvass in the Eastern European tradition the plain people brought with them, and the eggs absorb both the color and the bacterial culture. The resulting food delivers fermented vegetable acids, complete protein, and a probiotic load in a single bite. Lancaster County agricultural records show beet kvass listed as a household staple in nearly every plain community cookbook published between 1880 and 1940. The fourth ferment is the one mainstream America buried most thoroughly. Raw cultured buttermilk, not the thickened, pasteurized, gum-stabilized products sold in cartons today. Real buttermilk is what is left after butter is churned from raw, naturally soured cream. It contains living lactobacillus cultures, butyric acid precursors, and fat-soluble vitamins that pasteurization destroys. Amish dairies still produce it. They drink it daily. Children grow up on it. And those children, according to multiple studies of plain community health, develop asthma at roughly 1/4 the rate of their non-Amish neighbors in the same counties. That statistic deserves to land. 1/4 the rate. Same air, same pollen, same Pennsylvania weather, different milk. The fifth ferment is sour rye bread, Pennsylvania Dutch sourdough, leavened with a wild starter, passed down within families for generations. Some Amish starters in Lancaster County are documented to be over 100 years old, kept alive through continuous feeding, the way a hearth fire was once kept alive. The long fermentation breaks down phytic acid, predigests the gluten proteins, and produces a loaf that diabetic Amish elders tolerate at blood sugar levels while commercial bread spikes catastrophically. Penn State Extension has published guidance on traditional sourdough fermentation that confirms what the plain community has known since they crossed the Atlantic. The sixth ferment is fermented apple cider, not the filtered pasteurized juice in plastic jugs. The Amish press their apples in autumn and let the cider go through a controlled wild fermentation in oak barrels in the cellar. The resulting drink, consumed before it turns fully to vinegar, carries acetic acid bacteria, beneficial yeasts, and polyphenols, at concentrations modern processing destroys. A small glass with the evening meal is documented in plain household practice from the 18th century forward. This is where the investigation has to pause and ask the question every honest investigation eventually asks. If these foods are this well documented, if the health outcomes are this measurable, why did the rest of America stop making them? The answer is not a mystery. It is a timeline. Between 1900 and 1950, the American food system was industrialized in 3 coordinated waves. First, mandatory pasteurization laws passed state by state, beginning with Chicago in 1908 and rolling outward. The laws were written in response to genuine public health crises in urban dairies, but they made no exception for clean small farm production. They erased raw dairy from the mainstream supply. Second, refrigerated rail and truck shipping eliminated the economic need for fermentation as a preservation method. By 1955, a Midwestern grocery chain could ship fresh produce coast to coast. The crock in the cellar became a museum piece. Third, the post-war processed food industry, backed by advertising budgets the size of small national economies, reframed fermented foods as old-fashioned, unsanitary, embarrassing. A generation of American women were taught that the foods their mothers made were beneath them. The Amish were exempt from all 3 waves. They did not subscribe to the magazines. They did not watch the advertising. They kept their dairies small, their cellars cool, and their crocks full. While mainstream America traded living food for shelf-stable food, the plain community kept eating bacteria, and their hospital admission rates show it. The 7th ferment is fermented hot pepper relish, a Lancaster County tradition that uses the late summer pepper harvest, salt brined for 2 to 4 weeks, then jarred. The capsaicin combined with lactic acid bacteria produces a condiment used as digestive support, taken in small amounts before heavy winter meals. plain community cookbooks list it under remedies as often as under condiments. The 8th ferment is dilled green beans. They are long fermented in brine with garlic, dill heads, and grape leaves for crispness. This is not the quick pickled version. The slow version, 4 to 6 weeks, produces a vegetable preserved entirely without vinegar, entirely through the work of lactobacillus cultures pulling sugars from the bean and converting them to lactic acid. The 9th ferment is fermented horseradish. Grated fresh root combined with whey from cultured dairy, left to ferment briefly, then sealed. Used by the spoonful for sinus congestion, winter chest complaints, and as a daily digestive bitter. Pennsylvania Dutch household practice, preserved across generations, describes horseradish as the first food a plain woman reached for when a child came in coughing from the fields. The 10th ferment is the one that snaps the case shut, but it requires a moment of preparation first. Because before the 10th ferment is named, the practical question has to be answered. What does a viewer who has watched this far actually do this week to begin? Start with 1 jar. A 2-quart wide-mouth glass jar from any grocery store. 1 head of green cabbage, sliced thin. 1.5 tablespoons of fine sea salt. Mix the cabbage and salt in a large bowl. Press and squeeze with clean hands for 10 minutes until the cabbage releases its own brine. Pack it tightly into the jar, pressing down so the brine rises above the cabbage. Weight it with a smaller jar filled with water to keep the cabbage submerged. Cover loosely with a cloth. Leave it on the counter at room temperature for 10 to 14 days. Taste it on day 7. Taste it again on day 10. When the sourness is deep and the texture is still crisp, move it to the refrigerator. That is real sauerkraut. That is the first ferment. That is the doorway into the other 9. For raw cultured buttermilk without a dairy cow, find a small local dairy that sells unhomogenized milk and culture it at home with a spoonful of plain whole milk yogurt left at room temperature for 24 hours. For sourdough, request a starter from any home baker. They multiply, and bakers give them away. For fermented cider, buy unfiltered apple cider in autumn, pour it into a clean jar, cover with a cloth, and let wild yeasts do the rest. These are not exotic acquisitions. These are grocery store acquisitions. The barrier was never economic. The barrier was knowledge, which brings the investigation to the 10th ferment and to the closing of the case. The 10th ferment is the one most overlooked in modern accounts of Amish food, and the one plain grandmothers in Yoder and Byler households make first when sickness enters the home. It is fermented garlic honey, raw, unfiltered honey poured over peeled fresh garlic cloves in a glass jar, sealed loosely, left at room temperature for 1 month, turned daily. The honey draws moisture from the garlic. The garlic releases its compounds into the honey. A wild fermentation begins, gentle and slow. The result is a thick, dark, syrupy preparation that Lancaster County tradition treats as the household's first defense against winter illness. 1 spoonful at the first sign of a sore throat. 1 clove from the jar at the first chill. Honey alone is antimicrobial. Garlic alone is antimicrobial. Together, fermented, they produce a preparation Amish households have leaned on for 300 years. Made from 2 ingredients available in any American grocery store this afternoon. That is the 10th ferment. That is the missing piece. And that is why the hospital admission rates in Holmes County and Lancaster County look the way they look. What was lost in the rest of America was never knowledge that vanished. It was knowledge that was crowded out. The crocks were thrown away. The starters died. The cellars were converted to laundry rooms. But the bacteria did not disappear from the universe. They are still on the cabbage leaves in the produce aisle. They are still in the raw honey at the farmer's market. They are waiting for someone to put them back in a jar. Recovering these 10 ferments is not nostalgia. It is restoration. It is the act of a person who decided that the food system on the supermarket shelf is not the only food system available, and who chose to rebuild the older one in her own kitchen. Tell us in the comments which of the 10 your own grandmother used to make. Sauerkraut, chow chow, red beet eggs, sour rye, fermented cider, dilled beans, garlic honey. Name the one that came back to you while you were watching. Subscribe to follow the investigation. The archive is still being assembled. Next, the case file opens on a Pennsylvania Dutch herbal practice documented in a single farmhouse journal recovered from a Lancaster County estate sale, and on the specific plant that plain midwives used for 3 centuries before modern medicine had a name for what it does.